So have you ever been reading Acts 2, the story of Pentecost, and thought, what the heck is going on here? What does it mean when Peter says, I'll pour my spirit out on all flesh? And why does he use this verse? When we read Acts 2, it talks about people speaking in tongues, yet speaking in tongues isn't mentioned in Peter's explanation. Rather, it talks about prophecy. So what is going on here? So in this video, I'm going to explore the start of Peter's Pentecost sermon and answer these questions. So we're looking at Peter's Pentecost sermon, and it's set within the Pentecost narrative, and this narrative is about the Holy Spirit being poured out on the early believers in Jerusalem, and they see tongues of fire rest upon them, and they start speaking in tongues. And if you want to learn more about this Pentecost theophany, you can explore it in this video here. And so the crowd see what is happening, and they accuse the disciples, these believers in Jesus, of being drunk. And so Peter stands up and defends the actions of these early believers, saying they're not drunk. No, but rather what's happening here is fulfilling what Joel said in Joel chapter 2, verse 28 to 32. So Joel 2, 28 to 32 says this: "And afterward I'll pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I'll pour out my spirit in those days. I'll show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And so Joel 2, 28 to 32 talks about the Spirit of God coming down, and old men and young men, daughters and sons, everyone prophesying or dreaming or having visions. And the first question we should ask is, well, why isn't speaking in tongues mentioned in Joel 2? Right? That seems to us as the most distinctive feature of this Pentecost story. They spoke in other tongues. So why is it that Peter's explanation, which is him using Joel 2, 28 to 32, why is it that in this explanation there is no speaking in tongues? Well, first what we've got to realize is that actually what is unique to us about the Pentecost story might not be unique to the first hearers. So while we focus on the speaking in tongues in Acts 2, what is unique to them is that now everyone has the Holy Spirit. Let me explain. In the Old Testament, the Spirit of God would be given to a few people for a specific purpose. That is, the Holy Spirit was exclusive to the prophets, to the kings, and to a few other people who had a specific function to fulfill. So the Spirit was only given to a few, and it was only given in a very limited way. And so what we see here in Pentecost is that the Spirit is given to all, not just to kings, not just to prophets, but the Holy Spirit is given to all. The remarkable thing isn't necessarily the speaking in tongues, rather it is that everyone now has the Holy Spirit. And this idea that the Holy Spirit would be given to all actually stems back to Moses in Numbers 11. So in Numbers, Moses is having a really difficult time leading the people of Israel. So he goes to Yahweh and he says, "Look, I need some help." So Yahweh says to him, "Take 70 of the elders of Israel and bring them to the temple, and the spirit that is upon you I'll put on the elders." And so Moses does this, and these 70 elders receive the same spirit that was upon Moses. However, there are 2 elders that do not attend, and they're away from the temple, yet they receive the Spirit of God. And Joshua sees this, and he goes to Moses and he says, "Moses, we should stop this. No, they've received the Spirit away from the temple." And in reply to this, Numbers 11:29 says this: "But Moses replied, 'Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them.'" And so this idea of a universal spirit, that the Holy Spirit would be given to all, actually starts all the way back in Numbers 11, verse 29, where Moses says, look, I wish that actually everyone would have the Holy Spirit. And so then Joel picks up on this idea in Joel 2:28 and says, in the future, this will actually be fulfilled by Yahweh. And then it is actually fulfilled in Pentecost. So this is what is incredible for Peter and the first believers in Jesus. It's not necessarily the speaking in tongues, but that the Spirit has been given to all. Another thing to note is that Peter changes this quotation from Joel slightly. In Joel 2:28 it says, and after this I'll pour my Spirit out on all flesh. But Peter says, in the last days I'll pour my Spirit out on all flesh. So Peter swaps out and after this for in the last days. And so why does Peter do this? Why does he change the start of the quote? Well, it's interesting because some scholars actually argue that Peter here is quoting directly from Isaiah 2 verse 2, which says, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. As the highest of the mountains, it will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. So as we've already talked about in an earlier video, which you can watch here, the Pentecost theophany is connected most closely with the temple inauguration theophanies. And this early community that we see being developed in Acts 2 is a replacement of the physical temple. They are now this new eschatological temple of God. And so Peter here splices in a little reference here to Isaiah 2 verse 2, which indicates that Yahweh is establishing his new temple, which is now the church. And there's one final question to ask of this passage, and that is, how wide is Spirit baptism? Who is this Spirit baptism for? And it's quite interesting here that the Spirit is given to both men and to women. So the Spirit transcends gender. That it's given to both old and to young. So the Spirit transcends age. And it's also given to slaves and to elders. So it transcends class. That the Spirit is given to all. And indeed, this quotation is quite emphatic that even slaves will get the Spirit of God. So when we read this quotation, note the pronouns that are used on your children, on your sons, on your daughters, on your old people, on your young people, right? You is the main pronoun used. But when it gets to slaves, it says even, an emphatic, even on my slaves, or even on my servants. So it's quite emphatic that even the lowest of the low, slaves and servants, still get the Spirit of God. However, we could actually take this further and say that all of creation is baptized in the Spirit in this quotation in Joel 2. The quotation says, I'll pour my Spirit out on all flesh. Now, some English translations translate this Greek word flesh to mean people. I'll pour my Spirit out on all people. But actually, the Greek means flesh, and it is inclusive of non-human flesh. So that means that, yes, humans prophesy, and in their own way, creation engages in prophetic activity as well. And we see this in verse 19. And actually, Peter changes verse 19 a little bit. In Joel, it says, I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth. And Luke changes this slightly to say, I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below. And what's important to note here is that Peter has added in this language of signs. So we have this idea of wonders and signs, or signs and wonders. And this is connected to Jesus, right? Because later on in the Pentecost sermon, in Acts 2:22, Peter says Jesus was someone that went around showing signs and wonders. And likewise, at the end of Acts 2, in Acts 2:43, it says that the apostles did signs and wonders. So what's interesting here is that this prophetic activity that Jesus had been doing in the Gospels, and this prophetic activity that we see the disciples and the apostles do after Jesus in the rest of Acts, actually is paralleled to these signs and wonders that will be done in the heavens and on the earth. And so this all indicates that this baptism in the Holy Spirit is creation-wide, that it transcends gender, that it transcends age, that it transcends class, but that it's also inclusive of creation. So let me know what you think. Do you think that this baptism in the Holy Spirit is only for humans, or is the Spirit some way involved in creation, and do we see this happening in Acts 2? Moreover, what are the insights that you've had from Peter's use of Joel 2:28-32? I'd love to hear them in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, click like or subscribe. Thanks.